Between Freddy, Jason, and countless other slashers, horror movies were big business in the 1980s. So big, in fact, that many of the most popular franchises got their own video games, mostly from publisher LJN and its parent company Acclaim. Today we're going to be looking at the Nintendo Entertainment System version of A Nightmare on Elm Street and Friday the 13th, along with Warlock on the Super NES and Genesis. Now, those sure are video game adaptations of 80s horror films, but are any of them actually worth playing? To answer that question, I decided to flip through the pages of Electronic Gaming Monthly, Next Generation, Machines Sega, and more classic magazines that reviewed these games back when they first came out. Oh, I sure hope you have some No-Doz handy, because this is going to be a real stabby episode of 1980s Horror Review Crew.
Now home is where the action is with the new Super Spike B-Ball from Nintendo. Go for super spikes and big digs. And now up to 4 players can have some hot fun with the new NES Satellite, the only 4-player wireless remote. With B-Ball and Satellite, 2's company, and 4 is really a blast. Even if you're playing from 15 feet away. The new NES Satellite and Super Spike B-Ball. Nintendo, now you're playing with power. Sets and games each sold separately.
Depending on who you ask, Friday the 13th was either a misunderstood gem that was ahead of its time, or it was one of the worst 8-bit video games ever made. Released 9 years after the original movie introduced us to Camp Crystal Lake, and 8 movies into the franchise, pretty much everybody expected the LJN video game to be your basic side-scrolling action game. And at first glance, that's exactly what you're getting. However, there's actually a lot more strategy at play here, including tracking down important items and sneaking your way around Crystal Lake without being murdered by a mask-wearing Jason. And no, it's not his mother, which you might expect given the title. Of course, doing all this is incredibly hard, which is one of the reasons why this Friday the 13th game has a bad reputation. Let's see if any of the critics saw a gem hiding deep within the rough exterior. While there aren't a lot of reviews for Friday the 13th, the magazines that did bother to cover the game gave some truly fascinating takes. We're going to go ahead and kick things off with Electronic Gaming Monthly, which gave the game an average score of 3.25 out of 10. This review actually made history, believe it or not, as it would be the first time that any critic in the magazine gave a game a 2. A very poor game that displays little of what an action-adventure game should contain. The action portions of play are sparse, and the whole thing is topped off with graphics that are just plain bad. Friday the 13th is not very enjoyable at all. Steve largely agreed, giving it a 3. Friday the 13th could have been an excellent game with blood splurting and knives slashing. What we get instead is another boring Goonies 2 ripoff that is just plain dull. The graphics are substandard, and the whole game is slow and tedious to play. This game could turn even Jason's stomach. Now, it is worth noting that the other EGM critics gave the game a 4, which is relatively high compared to Ed's 2. Jim explains that Friday the 13th's gameplay is just awful. The graphics are plain, and you don't need to apply any strategy to beat the game. Just wear down Jason, and in the process, wear yourself down. A real loser. While EGM may have hated it, Computer Entertainer was a lot more willing to give this movie adaptation a chance. Giving the game a 3 out of 4, they explain that you have a lot to keep track of, as you can switch control among the teenagers, trying to keep the quickest of them busy seeking weapons, while the slower ones stay close enough to protect the children from Jason's inevitable attacks. There's a lot of area to cover, from the cabins and forests to bat-infested caves to the lake itself. Along with the fast-paced action, there's also a certain amount of strategy involved, since you must gather weapons and plan how to rid Crystal Lake of Jason. And if you've seen any of the umpteenth Friday the 13th movies, you know how impossible a task it is. Fans of the movie series are likely to enjoy the game. In all honesty, we are definitely not fans of these movies. But we were pleasantly surprised to find a pretty good game to back up the notorious license name on the package. Now look, if you're on the side that Friday the 13th is a misunderstood gem, then you have to be pretty impressed with the Computer Entertainer review. Despite not being a fan of the source material, I think they actually took time to understand what the game is asking of you. Unlike Electronic Gaming Monthly, which just wrote it off because it wasn't a generic action game. Given the polarized tags, you shouldn't be too surprised when I tell you that the Friday the 13th game's overall average is just 54%. It really is a shame that more magazines didn't cover it. If you were a fan of slashers in the 1980s, then you were either Team Jason or Team Freddy. One was a methodical killing machine that could seemingly appear out of nowhere, while the other was a jokester that invaded your dreams. Only 1 year after releasing Friday the 13th, LJN took on A Nightmare on Elm Street, a 1990 action survival game with a multiplayer twist. While Friday the 13th was a solo experience, you could actually have up to 4 players going up against Freddy Krueger thanks to the NES Satellite. Now, despite the multiplayer gimmick, this was a much more straightforward affair, which might actually work in its favor. Let's go ahead and see which team the critics were on. When it comes to Electronic Gaming Monthly, they were Team Freddy, but don't get too excited, because they weren't all that impressed with The Nightmare on Elm Street. Ed ended up giving it a 4, explaining that this game capitalizes on the movie name and doesn't deliver a decent game to back it up. The play is bare bones with the exception of some harder dream sequences, and delivers very little of the potential fun that the theme could have created. Steve, on the other hand, liked it enough to give it a 6. Elm Street does fare pretty good in most respects. The traditional gameplay to the dream world and back again provides an interesting twist, but the graphics aren't great and the play not as engrossing as it could have been. EGM gave Freddy an average score of 4.75 out of 10. Moving up the scale, we see Nintendo Power give the game a 3 out of 5. Of course, this was at a time when Nintendo Power didn't exactly explain their scores, so let's just move on to Video Games and Computer Entertainment, which gave the game a 7 out of 10, the highest score of any magazine. At the Consumer Electronics Show in June of 1988, LJN announced the licensing of the Elm Street name and Freddy character for an NES game. The promotional material they distributed looked extremely promising, with highly detailed screenshots and written description of a game where you controlled Freddy Krueger. 2 years have passed, and that germ of a game concept has been turned inside out. Happily, the final version of A Nightmare on Elm Street is a pretty decent game. A lot of people are sure to buy it because of the name alone, so it's a relief to find that there's more to it than Freddy's pretty face. With an overall average of 59%, the critics slightly preferred A Nightmare on Elm Street over Friday the 13th, which they gave a 54%. Both of these games had their detractors, like Electronic Gaming Monthly, and defenders, like Computer Entertainer and Video Games and Computer Entertainment. I guess it really does come down to who you want to believe.
We interrupt this program for a special announcement.
Freddy's here!
Yes, Freddy Krueger's back with a whole new season of nail-biting nightmares.
Oh, you gotta be out of your mind!
All new episodes of terror and suspense, Freddy style.
Party!
Freddy's Nightmares. Watch it if you dare.
And that's the way it is.
Freddy's Nightmares, Saturday at 7 on KTTY.
After releasing questionable games based on both Friday the 13th and A Nightmare on Elm Street, there really was only one obvious next move for LJN. No, not Halloween, or Phantasm, or Hellraiser, or Child's Play, or even the Ghoulies. I'm talking about Warlock, the 1989 film starring Julian Sands that bombed at the box office but was later resurrected through VHS rentals. Okay, look, I'll admit that this pick is not as high profile as maybe Freddy or Jason. Even with a sequel, the Warlock series was basically a non-factor in 1995 when both the Super NES and Genesis games were released. Is it because there was a drought of good slasher movies in the early 1990s? Or did Acclaim snag this license because it was dirt cheap? I guess we'll never know. Thankfully, we know exactly what the critics thought of this Warlock game. With no EGM reviews to look at, let's instead check in with the Australian magazine Hyper, which is just about as close to the middle of the pack as you can possibly get. Given the Super NES version, a 60%, Elliot Fish described it as a bit flashbacky, ghouls and ghosty, and Castlevania-ish. Warlock has a little bit of everything, but huge dollops of nothing. My excitement level during play was frighteningly low, and nothing Warlock could do saved me from leaning over and flicking my Super NES off from utter disinterest. Trying to battle flying demons when your character refuses to follow the most basic maneuvers is frustrating at least. But trying to nimbly hop from disintegrating platform to disintegrating platform is nearly impossible, and frankly, I don't have the time. Now, it is worth mentioning that Sega Vision gave the Genesis version of the game basically the same score as Hyper, a 3 out of 5. Next Generation went a bit lower when they reviewed the Super NES version, giving it a 2 out of 5. I would normally read that review, but let's check out their even harsher review of the Genesis port, which they gave a 1 out of 5. With Warlock, Acclaim managed to suck all the life from a bad movie and further demonstrate the uselessness of the side-scrolling game. Oh, and here's a new one. As you run from left to right, you can pick up healing magic potion and 1-ups. Some of the backgrounds are well shaded, and the accompanying music is a touch on the eerie side, but all the game does is prove that bad movies make horrible side-scrolling action games. When it comes to the more positive reviews, things are a bit of a mixed bag. Nintendo Power, for example, gave the game a 3.2 out of 5 in their 72nd issue, while Super Play went all the way up to a 68% in issue 31. Die Hard Game Fan didn't like it much better, giving it a 69%, nice, while GamePro gave the Genesis version a 3.5 out of 5. We'll talk more about GamePro in a minute, but first I want to look at the 72% that came from Machines Sega. Warlock doesn't do itself any favors with the appearance of its first few levels. It looks like the video game equivalent of a Hangover. Rough. But unlike many more unfortunate titles, the initial disappointment and confusion lifts somewhat with the prospect of a tough challenge and gameplay that mixes platform blasting with puzzle genres. As you get deeper, the tasks get more complex and the gameplay more rewarding. Okay, it's never going to win a beauty contest, but it's far better company than any of those Pamela Anderson platformers. Okay, before you start to question the Pam Anderson comparison, let's go ahead and talk about the magazine that gave Warlock the highest marks. I'm of course referring to GamePro, who may have given the Genesis version a 3.5 out of 5, but ended up giving the Super NES version a slightly higher 4 out of 5. Warlock won't set your system on fire, but despite the somewhat frustrating controls, it's a good intermediate adventure with some truly challenging puzzles. However, Warlock is definitely no lock. Ugh, yeah, that was a stretch, even for GamePro. With the scores all over the place, it turns out that the overall average lands at 60%. Now, in case you're wondering which system came out ahead, it was definitely the Super NES, which averaged a 62%. Compare that to the 58% that we saw from the Genesis reviews. I mean, neither instills a whole lot of confidence, but at least it scored better than A Nightmare on Elm Street or Friday the 13th. That's something, right?
Coming soon from Trimark Interactive.
Warlock is here.
The ultimate action-adventure 16-bit video game experience.
It is time.
Warlock, the game. Travel through time to the Dark Ages. Explore evil castles. Do battle in the caverns of a mythical underworld.
There are 6 stones. You must possess them all to win.
Warlock. Available only from Trimark Interactive. Warlock, the video game. Look for it soon.
Hey, thanks for watching me break down these reviews. If you liked what you saw here, then you should know that we post new episodes just like this every time classic games get added to modern consoles. And sometimes even when they aren't, like this horror-themed episode. Now, here's the question I have for you. What 1980s horror movie would make the best video game? There really are so many great horror films from that decade, many of which I didn't even mention here, including some of them that have already been turned into games, like Evil Dead or Killer Clowns. Let me see your picks in the comments below. In other news, unless Nintendo announces something, we're just going to finish off the week with a pair of reviews. We're also going to be looking at all of the Ninja Gaiden games this weekend in a big super episode. While I wait for that, I strongly recommend you click that subscribe button and support what we're doing here. Until then,